Hey guys, so for today's video I have picked out something that is, while important, at least to me and to what I like to study, it's pretty heavy. So just a warning. For today's lesson video, I've picked out something that I've been wanting to talk about for some time, but it required some digging up of material, and that would be the Stanford Prison Study. The Stanford Prison Study, for those who are not aware or haven't heard of it, was a psychological study done in 1971 where a small group of psychologists essentially recreated the environment of a prison using regular everyday people to sort of figure out why the way that the prison system worked, and how full of violence and hatred it is, whether that was due to the people or not. And I'll obviously give you more of a background than that, but so that you guys know what you're getting into and what you're going to be learning about. And that's what it is. And within the field of psychology, which would be my field, it is considered to be one of the most important studies done. It is, again, it's 1971, so not quite as old as Pavlov's dogs or, Freud, but in terms of importance and how much we've learned about the mind because of it, it's up there, especially for those interested in related fields of, sociology and criminal justice. So this takes psychology more in that sort of direction and away from the, personality psychology that I've focused on in previous videos, where I've talked about, ego development and maturity and, introversion versus extroversion, stuff like that. But it is something that I am deeply fascinated with, and the field of, the overlap between psychology and justice is one that I actually studied a lot of. Even, when I was in my undergrad and getting my bachelor's, I received a minor in legal studies along with my major in psychology. And when I was taking these classes, I took a 2-part course in psychology and law, which was meant to sort of bridge the gap between the two, and that's what got me interested in all this sort of stuff. And so I have picked out, after a lot of digging, I found my old college notebook from this class. And now you may ask why it is important for me to have dug out my college notebook instead of just looking up the information on the internet. Well, that is because my professor for this class was one of the TAs for the study. And the field of psychology and law was his major field. And in fact, it seems that after TAing for this study and doing a lot of, research into this and becoming thoroughly involved with the academia in the point between psychology and law, it became his thing. And he has, worked in the field and taught classes like the 2-part course that I mentioned. But yes, he has done a lot since then. But for now, today, I am going to take you back to 1971. When 1971, my professor was a TA for, one of the TAs for Philip Zimbardo. And Zimbardo is another name that if you are familiar with the field of psychology, you probably are familiar with some of Zimbardo's studies, or, if you've done any research into psychology, you've probably come across a number of papers where it's Zimbardo et al., or even had a textbook that was written by him. But Zimbardo is a huge, huge person in the field of psychology, in social psychology particularly. And, there was a class at Stanford, of course, being the Stanford Prison Study, on social psychology and action, and they had an ex-inmate from San Quentin to do a guest lecture. After finding out that this man was, having trouble after, of course, being in prison and having trouble having a job and stuff like that, they taught a summer course where they focused on, the psychology of prison inmates, where they focused on him and had other guards and people working in the prisons, as well as ex-inmates, as guest lecturers. The class went really well. The students loved it. They wanted to continue, having this class also during the school year. But one thing that Zimbardo noticed in teaching this class was that the students seemed to think that the brutality of the prison environment was due to either sadistic guards or violent prisoners. The idea that the prisoners were violent because they were all in there for violent offenses, so of course they are going to, when put into a building with each other and made to stay with each other 24/7, of course they are going to constantly be violent. And then secondly, the notion was the guards must be sadistic because only a sadistic person would want to become a prison guard. And the students seemed to think this, even though it seems the guests and guest lecturers did not agree. And this caused him to have the idea of how could we do an experiment to figure out if this is true or not. And the study, so they set up this study to decide whether it's the personalities of the people in the situation that causes prisons to be such a brutal place, or whether it's the situation itself that brings out the worst in people. And so they picked out 20, my professor called them abnormally normal students, where, they were healthy, they were normal, resilient, and they were paid, this is going to be important later, they were paid $15 a day. Half were made prisoners, half were made guards, completely random. And they made the environment as similar to a prison as they could. So, it was in a basement, they had barred doors, of course they had the rules of prisoners and guards, and they would see psychologists. They had, even Zimbardo himself was in on it. He was, I believe, the warden, or something to that effect. So he had a position in this orchestrated thing. And they had to, fill out surveys regularly. There were cameras and microphones set up around to collect data. And in fact, there is some public footage available online. It's pretty easy to search for. You can, even type into YouTube and find videos. And they expected everything to be alright. The plan was 2 weeks, pretty easy, but it didn't last 2 weeks. It didn't even, barely lasted one. So at the beginning of the study, when they brought in the people, they didn't just bring them in, they actually arrested them. So they had, they drove the prisoners in police cars and, went up to their houses and drove them to the location and had them greeted by the warden, Zimbardo. They were strip-searched, deloused, dressed in prison-like attire. So they had their little prison numbers. They were given a stocking cap and sandals to wear, just all the same types of clothing, like in the prison system, where it becomes evident with even the way they're dressed. Everyone is supposed to look the same, and that there's that sense of uniformity, So they tried to do that by giving everyone the same type of bland uniform and having their little prison numbers and addressing them by their numbers, like is the case in prisons. So yeah, the number replaced their name. They were given the stocking caps for anonymity, so even their hair was covered. Having them, dress the same. The guards were given no instructions. They were able to, told to make up their own rules. And they were, of course, warned about the seriousness of the situation. They were also given identical uniforms, as well as reflective aviator sunglasses, whistles, and billy clubs, so that they're made to feel powerful but anonymous. The count was 3 prisoners per cell. They had lineups every night. Every prisoner lines up and they count them off, so counts is what they called. They had push-ups as punishment, and this was all laid out and done over the first day. It was August 14th. So August 15th, 1971, a rebellion begins. Prisoners rip off their caps and barricade themselves into their cages and rip off their numbers. Guards used fire extinguishers on the prisoners, broke in, stripped them, and forced them into solitary confinement. This is the second day. These were abnormally normal people. They were college students. And day 2, there's already this fight. They noticed on day 2 psychological tactics being used. So they started giving the 3 best prisoners advantages. So special cells, better food, more privileges, and then would move them around to confuse them so that they wouldn't trust each other. Because, the moment certain prisoners are being treated better than others, they start to not trust each other, because it's like, what would you do to get those advantages? How do I know that I can trust you? And anyone who watches Orange is the New Black knows that. That's, another thing that I happen to enjoy that I probably wouldn't if I hadn't gone into this, but a lot of that is very accurate from what I've heard. So anyway, moving on. Guards were allowed to, even deny prisoners use of the restrooms, of toilets, which seems a bit silly, but such a basic need to be able to deny someone the right to basic needs dehumanizes them. And 36 hours into the study, so partway through day 2, about halfway through the second day, the first prisoner is released. Due to complaints of their disorganized thinking, screaming, crying, rage, basically this person couldn't handle it anymore. And they thought he was faking it at first. And at this point, it became evident that this is no longer just an experiment. It was actually, one person on day 2 had been seriously psychologically affected by this study, and they had to let him go. Day 3, August 16th, 1971, there was an escape plot, or at least rumors of an escape plot that released that there were rumors that the prisoner who was let out was going to break back in and help people escape. So they, moved everyone out and doubled security and moved back in. There was more punishments, more humiliation. And there's a note here that one of Zimbardo's fellow academics ran into him and asked him about, those basic questions about an experiment, what about the variables, and, asked, well, what's the independent variable? How are you going to measure this? And he got so angry and sort of stormed off saying, well, I've got better stuff to do, and realized that, he was getting really seriously into this role. So, even Zimbardo's cognition, even his thinking was being affected by this whole scenario. Even he was so into this role that he was a bit blindsided. Later that day also there was another prisoner, so second prisoner broke down and had to be released. Later on in the day, I believe it must have been a Sunday or something, because it mentions prisoners requesting church services. And they talked to the priests. They introduced themselves by their numbers. This is the third day. They're introducing themselves by their numbers, not their names. They've already gotten used to this. The priests tried to convince them to get help to get out of prison and to call for the lawyers and stuff like this. Also, another big thing is that, again, still day 3, a lot happens in one day. One of the prisoners, I have his number listed here, which is kind of funny, but I guess they want him to remain anonymous, but 8119 was sick. So they put him in solitary while looking into, how to get him a doctor or something like that. Other prisoners rejected him, chanted that he was a bad prisoner, meaning he didn't want to leave solitary because, he feared that they would, they would react negatively against him because they were calling him a bad prisoner for being sick. And Zimbardo had to remind him that it was an experiment and that he had the freedom to leave. So, again, the prisoners were so deep in this, they had to be reminded that they had the freedom to leave at any moment. Day 4, the only thing that was mentioned, that they were brought into rooms and asked that if they could give up all the money they earned, again, it was $15 a day they were earning, they could give that up to be released. Would they do that? And all of the prisoners, except for 2 of them, said yes, but not a single one asked about leaving the study. They all just returned back to their cells and acted like it was normal. And that's the point at which, they could have asked to leave the experiment, but it was so embedded in their minds that they couldn't think about it, even though they had just been given the thought. It was like the idea wasn't real to them. On the fifth day, August 18th, they did an analysis of the prison guards, and they sort of looked at, how they had responded, and about a third of them were lawful, doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing, whatever. About a third of them were good and, kind of took pity on the prisoners, and a third of them were sadistic in, taking pleasure and giving extra punishments and humiliating them and stuff like that. Prisoners either took the positions of being rebellious and, like the ones who fought back, complacent, probably like I imagine the prisoner who got sick and had to be reminded that it was an experiment before he was willing to leave. I imagine that he fell under the complacent category, where, just doing everything you're told, or sort of military good, like very, yes sir, thank you sir, strict, but still, I guess, being good and less fear from the sound of it. Also on day 5, number 416, again, just given the number, started a hunger strike, and the guards force-fed him, threatened to cut off his visiting hours so that the prisoners would all go against him, or threatened to cut off not just his visiting hours, but everyone's visiting hours, so the prisoners would go up against him, and ended up in solitary for hours. And the prisoners were approached and said, if you give up your blankets, then he can come out of solitary, and none of them did. So, none of them were, at this point, it was very dog-eat-dog, I guess. On day 6, parents of the one of the prisoners brought a lawyer and tried to bail their son out of jail. So, again, even the parents of these students were getting so wrapped up in these rules. They were treating it like it was real. They were treating it like they were really in prison. And that's when they realized that the experiment had to end. And everyone was too into it. There was multiple incidents of, Zimbardo's, the academic who's asking him about the study, and he realizes he's far too invested in the case. And this is, another, also an example of a study which could have been better done. There are studies that are blind or double-blind. So, blind meaning, the observer doesn't know what the study's about. But very clearly, here, the observer, Zimbardo, is so involved in the study that he can't look at it objectively. And because he couldn't look at it objectively, he couldn't tell, he didn't notice that things were going very bad very quickly, and that things were so bad, and in fact, seriously psychologically affecting these students to the extent where it was not really an ethical study to begin with. So even the psychologists working on it got wrapped up in the rules, the prisoners, the guards, even the parents of the students who tried to, bail their kids out of jail. When the kid was in an experiment, they could have called up Zimbardo and said, hey, I don't like this. I want my son out. But they called a lawyer as if like they thought their kid was seriously in prison. There was also, I don't have this in my notes, but I remember my professor telling us about how on visitor day, which I believe was on the second or third day, the parents were shown around. So again, the parents were involved in this study as well. They were shown around on, I think, like I said, second or third day, what the conditions were like. And instead of saying, I don't want my son in this situation, I'm taking him out of the experiment, they talked to the guards and they asked them, well, my son's, like a parent would say, oh, my son was a good boy. Could you please make conditions a little bit better for him? Or, take pity on him. He's a good boy, a good kid. That sort of stuff. So, again, it's astonishing how quickly the mind can take on these rules, particularly when a person is being dehumanized and almost like the cases with the prisoners especially, made to be like some sort of animal. So, and I think that's all the notes. Yeah, so basically, it was made to sort of challenge the idea that the prisoners and the guards were inherently sadistic and violent, which that idea was proven to be incorrect, because if prison conditions like this, if faked prison conditions in the basement of a Stanford University building can make regular, everyday college students act like prisoners and guards, then it has nothing to do with the people in those situations and everything to do with the situation that they're being put through. So that's the first main point. Even when the first person broke down, again, 36 hours on the second day, someone broke down, and the immediate assumption was that there was something wrong with him. The assumption was, let's look at his file. Are we sure he didn't show signs of, depression or insanity or whatever beforehand? That was the first thought, was there was something wrong with him and not something wrong with this system. And then also the fact that the whole institution was incredibly irrational, that, everyone was acting as if everything that was going on was real and logical when it wasn't. And, the presumption of institutional legitimacy, so that being that, even the parents and the priests acted like this was a legitimate institution and that they had to follow by these rules. And yet, at the end of the study, the guards actually got into an argument with the staff about why this was being terminated, and they didn't think it should be terminated. Because, that's like telling a guard, hey, we're going to close this prison and set them all free. They reacted exactly like that. So, that just goes to show you how much we underestimate how much our environment affects our actions. So, if you get one thing out of this entire video, if you have long since stopped paying attention to my words, I hope that you at least get this out of it, and that is how much your environment affects your personality and your behavior. Alright. Thanks for listening. Hope you guys found this fascinating. Hope you guys learned stuff. And I will see you guys next time.